So welcome one and all to the scary times. Let's have a story, shall we? First off, we have a story called Gabriel Ernest. This is by Saki, real name Hector Hugo Monroe. There is a wild beast in your woods, said the artist Cunningham as he was being driven to the station. It was the only remark he had made during the drive, but as Van Cheele had talked incessantly, his companion's silence had not been noticeable. Oh, a stray fox or two and some resident weasels, nothing more formidable, said Van Cheele. The artist said nothing. What do you mean about a wild beast, said Van Cheele later when they were at the platform. Nothing, my imagination. Here's my train, said Cunningham. That afternoon, Van Cheele went for one of his frequent rambles throughout his woodland property. He had a stuffed bittern in his study and he knew the names of quite a number of wildflowers, so his aunt had possibly some justification in describing him as a great naturalist. At any rate, he was a great walker. It was his custom to take mental notes of everything he saw during his walks, not so much for the purpose of assisting contemporary science as to provide topics for conversation afterwards. When the bluebells began to show themselves in flower, he made a point of informing everyone of the fact. The season of the year might have warned these hearers of the likelihood of such an occurrence, but at least they felt he was being absolutely frank with them. What Van Cheele saw on this particular afternoon was, however, something far removed from his ordinary range of experience. On a shelf of smooth stone overhanging a deep pool in the hollow of an oak coppice, a boy of about 16 lay asprawl, drying his wet brown limbs luxuriously in the sun. His wet hair, parted by a recent dive, lay close to his head, and his light brown eyes, so light there was almost a tigerish gleam to them, were turned towards Van Cheele with a certain lazy watchfulness. It was an unexpected apparition, and Van Cheele found himself engaged in a novel process of thinking before he spoke. Where on earth could this wild-looking boy hail from? The miller's wife had lost a child, 2 months ago, supposed to have been swept away by the mill race, but that'd been a mere baby, not a half-grown lad. What are you doing here? He demanded. Obviously sunning myself, said the boy. Well, where do you live? Here, in these woods. You can't live in the woods, said Van Cheele. They're very nice woods, said the boy with a touch of patronage in his voice. But where do you sleep at night? I don't sleep at night. That's my busiest time. Van Cheele began to have an irritated feeling that he was grappling with a problem that was eluding him. Well, what do you feed on? He asked. Flesh, said the boy, and he pronounced the word with slow relish as though he were tasting it. Flesh? What flesh? Well, since it interests you, rabbits, wildfowl, hares, poultry, lambs in their season, children when I can get any. They're usually too well locked in at night when I do most of my hunting. It's quite 2 months since I tasted child flesh. Ignoring the chafing nature of the last remark, Van Cheele tried to draw the boy on the subject of possible poaching operations. Well, you're talking rather through your hat when you speak of feeding on hares. Considering the nature of the boy's toilet, his simile was hardly an apt one. Our hillside hares aren't easily caught. At night, I hunt on 4 feet, was the somewhat cryptic response. Oh, I suppose you mean you hunt with a dog, hazarded Van Cheele. The boy rolled slowly over onto his back and laughed a weird, low laugh that was pleasantly like a chuckle, disagreeably like a snarl. I don't fancy any dog would be anxious for my company, especially at night. Van Cheele began to feel there was something positively uncanny about the strange-eyed, strange-tongued youngster. Well, I can't have you staying in these woods, he declared authoritatively. I rather fancy you'd rather be here than in your house, said the boy. The prospect of this wild, nude animal in Van Cheele's primly ordered house was certainly an alarming one. Well, if you don't go, I shall have to make you, said Van Cheele. The boy turned in a flash, plunged into the pool, and in a moment had flung his wet and glistening body halfway up the bank where Van Cheele was standing. In an otter, the movement would not have been remarkable, but in a boy, Van Cheele found it sufficiently startling. His foot slipped as he made an involuntary backward movement, and he found himself almost prostrate on the slippery, weed-grown bank, with those tigerish yellow eyes not very far from his own. Almost instinctively, he half raised his hand to his throat. The boy laughed again, a laugh that was with which the snarl had nearly driven out the chuckle, and then with another of his astonishing lightning movements, plunged out of view into a yielding tangle of weed and fern. "What an extraordinary wild animal," said Van Cheele as he picked himself up. And then he recalled Cunningham's remark, "There's a wild beast in your woods." Walking slowly homeward, Van Cheele began to turn over in his mind various local occurrences which might be traceable to the existence of this astonishing young savage. Something had been thinning the game in the woods lately. Poultry had been missing from the farms. Hares were growing unaccountably scarcer, and complaints had reached him of lambs being carried off bodily from the hills. Was it possible this wild boy was really hunting the countryside in company of some clever poacher dog? He'd spoken of hunting 4-footed by night, but then again he'd hinted strangely that no dog caring to come near him, especially at night. It was certainly puzzling. And then as Van Cheele ran his mind over the various depredations that had been committed during the last month or two, he came suddenly to a dead stop, alike in his walk and his speculations. The child missing from the mill 2 months ago. The accepted theory was that it had tumbled into the mill race and been swept away. But the mother had always declared she'd heard a shriek on the hillside of the house in the direction opposite from the water. It was unthinkable, of course, but he wished the boy had not made that uncanny remark about child flesh eaten 2 months ago. Such dreadful things should not be said even in fun. Van Cheele, contrary to his usual wont, did not feel disposed to be communicative about his discovery in the wood. His position as a parish councillor and justice of the peace seemed somehow compromised by the fact that he was harbouring a personality of such doubtful repute on his property. There was even a possibility of a heavy bill of damages for raided lambs and poultry might be laid at his door. At dinner that night, he was quite unusually silent. "Where's your voice gone to?" said his aunt. "One would think you'd seen a wolf." Van Cheele was not that familiar with the old saying. Thought the remark rather foolish. If he had seen a wolf on his property, his tongue would have been extraordinarily busy on the subject. At breakfast the next morning, Van Cheele was conscious of his feeling of uneasiness regarding yesterday's episode, but not wholly disappeared, and he resolved to go by train to the neighbouring cathedral town, hunt up Cunningham, and learn from him what he had really seen that had prompted the remark about a wild beast in the woods. With this resolution taken, his usual cheerfulness partially returned, and he hummed a bright little melody as he sauntered into the morning room for his customary cigarette. As he entered the room, the melody made way abruptly for a pious invocation. Gracefully asprawl on the ottoman, in an attitude of almost exaggerated repose, was the boy from the woods. He was drier than when Van Cheele had seen him last, but no other alteration was noticeable in his toilet. "How dare you come in here?" asked Van Cheele furiously. "Well, you told me I wasn't to stay in the woods," said the boy calmly. "But not to come here. Supposing my aunt should see you." With a view to minimizing the catastrophe, Van Cheele hastily obscured as much of his unwelcome guest as possible under the folds of that morning's Morning Post. At that moment, his aunt entered the room. This is a poor boy who's lost his way. He's lost his memory. He doesn't know who he is or where he comes from," exclaimed Van Cheele, desperately glancing apprehensively at the waif's face to see whether he was going to add inconvenient candour to his other savage propensities. Miss Van Cheele was enormously interested. I'll bet she was. "Perhaps his underlinen is marked," she suggested. He seems to have lost most of that too," said Van Cheele, making frantic little grabs at the Morning Post to keep it in its place. A naked, homeless child appeared to appeal to Miss Van Cheele as warmly as a stray kitten or a derelict puppy would have done. "Then we must do all we can for him," she decided. And in a very short time, a messenger, dispatched to the rectory, where a page boy was kept, had returned with a suit of pantry clothes and the necessary accessories of shirt, shoes, collar, etc. Clothed, clean, and groomed, the boy lost none of his uncanniness in Van Cheele's eyes, but his aunt found him sweet. "We must call him something till we know who he really is," she said. "Gabriel Ernest, I think. Those are nice, suitable names." Van Cheele agreed, but he privately doubted whether they were being grafted onto a nice, suitable child. His misgivings were not diminished by the fact that his staid and elderly spaniel had bolted out the house at the first incoming of the boy and was now obstinately remained shivering and yapping at the farther end of the orchard, while the canary, usually as vocally industrious as Van Cheele himself, had put itself into an allowance of tiny, frightened cheeps. More than ever, he was resolved to consult Cunningham without loss of time. As he drove off to the station, his aunt was arranging that Gabriel Ernest should help her to entertain the infant members of her Sunday school class at tea that afternoon. Cunningham was not at first disposed to be communicative. "My mother died of some brain trouble, he explained, so you'll understand why I'm adverse to dwelling on anything of an impossibly fantastic nature that I might see or think I might have seen. But what did you see? Pressed Van Cheele. What I thought I saw was something so extraordinary that no really sane man could dignify it with the credit of having actually happened. I was standing the last evening I was with you, half hidden in the hedge undergrowth by the orchard gate, watching the dying glow of the sunset. Suddenly I became aware of a naked boy, a bather from some neighbouring pool, I took him to be, who was standing out on the bare hillside, also watching the sunset. His pose was so suggestive of some wild form of pagan myth that I instantly wanted to engage him as a model, and in another moment I think I would have hailed him. But just then the sun dipped out of view, and all the orange and pink slid out of the landscape, leaving it cold and grey. And at the same moment an astounding thing happened. The boy vanished too. What? Vanished away into nothing? Asked Van Cheele excitedly. No, that was the dreadful part of it, answered the artist. On the open hillside where the boy had been standing a second ago stood a large wolf, blackish in colour, with gleaming fangs and cruel yellow eyes. Now, you may think that Van Cheele did not stop for anything as futile as thought. Already he was tearing at top speed back towards the station. He dismissed the idea of a telegram. Gabriel Ernest as a werewolf was a hopelessly inadequate effort at conveying the situation, and his art would think it was a code message to which he had forgotten to give her the key. His one hope was that he might reach home before sundown. The cab which he chartered at the other end of the railway journey bore him with what seemed exasperating slowness along the country roads, which were pink and mauve with the flush of the sinking sun. His aunt was putting away some unfinished jams and cake when he arrived. "Where is Gabriel Ernest?" he almost screamed. "Well, he's taking a little tube child home," said his aunt. "It was getting too late, so I thought it wasn't safer to let it go back alone. What a lovely sunset, isn't it?" But Van Cheele, although not oblivious of the glow of the western sky, didn't stay to discuss its beauties, and at a speed for which he was scarcely geared, he raced along the narrow lane that led to the home of the Toops. On one side ran the swift current of the mill stream, and on the other rose the stretch of bare hillside. A dwindling rim of red sun showed still on the skyline, and the next turning must bring him into view of the ill-assorted couple that he was pursuing. Then the colour went suddenly out of things, and a grey light settled itself with a quick shiver over the landscape. Van Cheele heard a shrill wail of fear and stopped running. Nothing was ever seen again of the Toop child or Gabriel Ernest, but the latter's discarded garments were found lying in the road, so it was assumed that the child had fallen in the water and the boy had stripped and jumped in a vain endeavour to save it. Van Cheele and some workmen who were nearby at the time testified to hearing a child scream loudly just near the spot where the clothes were found. Mrs. Toop, who had 11 other children, was decently resigned to her bereavement, but Miss Van Cheele sincerely mourned her lost foundling. It was on her initiative that a memorial brass was put up in the parish church to Gabriel Ernest, an unknown boy who bravely sacrificed his life for another. Van Cheele gave way to his aunt in most things, but he flatly refused to subscribe to the Gabriel Ernest Memorial. The end. There you go, folks. You can put your microphones on back now at the moment for a little natter if you wish. And now, has anybody heard that story before? It's quite a well-known Saki tale. Anyone know about that?
No, never heard it before.
Good. I'm glad. I hope you liked it. Now, Saki himself, I thought I'd do a little research and try and keep you entertained and also educated, because that's the sort of bloke I am. Saki himself, his real name was Hector Hugh Munro. He was born in British Burma in 1870. His father was an inspector general in the Indian Imperial Police, and his mother died when he was barely 2 years old, and his father sent him and his brother and sister to stay in Devon to be raised by his grandmother and paternal maiden aunts. So you might recognize one of the paternal maiden aunts in the second Saki story I'll do for you later. He was educated at Bedford School. He travelled extensively in Europe with his father after his father's retirement, and he even moved back to Burma to work there, but couldn't stand the heat and couldn't stand constantly getting fever. He became a professional writer in 1896, and after gaining a reputation for satirical political sketches, he took up a position with the Morning Post as their foreign correspondent, working extensively in the Balkans, Russia, and in Paris. And it was shortly after taking up his writing career that he chose the pen name Saki, which, as you all know, was the cupbearer of the Omar Khayyam. I mean, obviously everyone knew that. At the time of the outbreak of the First World War, he was 43. He was too old officially to enlist, but he enlisted anyway. He refused to commission and joined the 2nd King's Edward's Horse as an ordinary trooper, then joined the 22nd Battalion of the Royal Fusiliers and was promoted to Lance Sergeant, which is a rank I don't think they have anymore. Well, unfortunately, in November 1916, while sheltering in a shell crater during the Battle of the Ancre, he was killed by a German sniper. He has no known grave. His body was lost, but he is commemorated on the Thriepval Memorial in Flanders. And if you do get a chance to read any of his other stuff, he wrote 2 novels, but he just wrote reams and reams of short stories, and they're all very entertaining and slightly odd, and some of them are very, very funny as well. He wrote a very funny one about advertising and how evil it was, called Phil Boyd's Studge, which is a wonderful name. And there's also one fantastic story he wrote about a talking cat called Tobamori, where this guy teaches a cat how to talk. And then you suddenly realize that you really shouldn't teach a cat to talk, because cats see things and say things that they really shouldn't say. And everyone's looking at their cats now. Yeah. So we move on to our second little... There's the cats. There's Graham Morris's cat. Fantastic. Thank you, Goff. So we're going on to Neil Gaiman now. Now, Neil Gaiman is a very well-known writer, a very popular science fiction writer, general fiction writer, fantasy writer. Again, I did some research on him because I knew of him but didn't know much about him. He was born in Porchester in Hampshire in 1960 to a family descended from Polish Jewish immigrant background. He had no clear idea exactly when his family came over to England, but they know it was before 1914. But his family's religious setups are still equally bizarre, because it's generally a mixture of Judaism and Scientology, because his dad was the chief Scientologist for Britain for many years, based down at East Grinstead. So they go, I'm going to turn me off the microphone because I'm going to shout at my son because he's started swearing very loudly upstairs, and I don't want him to ruin the story. There, I shouted and you didn't hear it. Right. The joy of it. All I can do is him upstairs going, fuck, shit, man. I really don't need that while I'm trying to do an atmospheric ghost story. His first ever paid proper writing job, Neil Gaiman, was he had to write a book about Duran Duran for the teeny bop market in 1984. I love it.
That's why I like his writing.
I knew it something good about it. He's done short stories, novels, poetry, comics, film and TV screenplays. Famously co-authored, of course, Bad Omens with the wonderful Terry Pratchett, which the second series of that is going to be on TV very soon, so look out for that. And of course, he's also written 2 stories for Doctor Who. How would I possibly know that? So let's move on to Neil Gaiman's story. Now, this is, as I said earlier, this is a wonderful example of no real massive plot, but just a lot of atmosphere. And it's a wonderful, creepy little story. It's called Don't Ask Jack. It is very brief, so I'll try and read it slowly, otherwise we'll be finished before we even know it. And just hope you enjoy it. So have a listen to this. Don't Ask Jack by Neil Gaiman. Nobody knew where the toy had come from, which great-grandparent or distant aunt had owned it before it was given to the nursery. It was a box, carved and painted in gold and red. It was undoubtedly attractive and, so the grown-ups maintained, quite valuable, perhaps even an antique. The latch, unfortunately, had rusted shut, and the key had been lost, so the Jack would never be released from his box. Still, it was a remarkable box, heavy, carved, gilt. The children didn't play with it. It sat in the bottom of the huge old wooden toy box, which was the same size and age as a pirate's treasure chest, or so the children said. The Jack in the box was buried beneath dolls, trains, clowns and paper stars and old conjuring tricks and crippled marionettes with their strings irrevocably tangled with dressing up clothes. Here the tatters of a long ago wedding dress, There, a black silk hat crusted with age and time, and costume jewelry, broken hoops, and tops, and hobby horses, and under all of them was Jack's box. The children didn't play with it. They whispered among themselves alone in the attic nursery. On grey days where the wind howled about the house and the rain rattled the slates and pattered down the eaves, they told each other stories about Jack, although they'd never seen him. One claimed that Jack was an evil wizard, placed in the box as punishment for crimes too awful to describe. Another, I'm certain that this was one of the girls, maintained that Jack's box was Pandora's box, and he had been placed in the box as guardian to prevent the bad things inside it from ever coming out. They would not even touch the box if they could help it, although when, as happened from time to time, an adult would comment on the absence of that sweet old Jack in the box and retrieve it from the chest and place it in a position of honor on the mantelpiece, then the children would pluck up the courage and later hide it away once more in the darkness. The children didn't play with the Jack in the box, and when they grew up and left the great house, the attic nursery was closed up and virtually forgotten. Almost, but not entirely. For each of the children separately remembered walking alone in the moon's blue light on his or her own bare feet up to the nursery. It was almost like sleepwalking, feet soundless on the wood of the stairs, on the threadbare nursery carpet, remembered opening the treasure chest, pouring through the dolls and the clothes, and pulling out the box. And then the child would touch the catch and the lid would open, slow as the sunset, and the music would begin to play. And Jack came out, not with a pop and a bounce. He was no spring-heeled Jack, but deliberately, intently, he would rise from the box and motion to the child to come closer, closer, and smile. And there in the moonlight, he told them each things they could never quite remember, things they were never able entirely to forget. The oldest boy died in the Great War. The youngest, after their parents died, inherited the house, although it was taken from him when he was found in the cellar one night with cloths and paraffin and matches, trying to burn the great house to the ground. They took him to the madhouse. Perhaps he's still there. The other children, who had once been girls and now were women, declined, each and every one, to return to the house in which they had grown up. And the windows of the house were boarded up, and the doors were all locked with huge iron keys. And the sisters visited it as often as they visited their eldest brother's grave, and the sad thing that had once been their younger brother, which is to say, never. Years have passed, and the girls are old women, and owls and bats have made their homes in the old attic nursery. Rats build their nests among the forgotten toys. The creatures gaze incuriously at the faded prints in the walls and stain the remnants of the carpet with their droppings. And deep within the box, Jack waits and smiles, holding his secrets. He's waiting for the children. He can wait forever. The end. Isn't that great? I absolutely bloody love that story because, as I say, nothing really happens. There's no plot, but it just oozes eeriness. It oozes atmosphere and brilliant writing. Brilliant writing. And that's just Neil Gaiman.
Excellent.
That is great.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah.
I'm sorry Sue and Ian down in Wales aren't here because when I was originally doing this idea for this show, I said to her I was doing a Saki story. And she said, well, which one? And I said, Gabriel Ernest, because it's one of my favourites. And she said, oh, what about Sredni Vashtar, which was her favourite? And I'd completely forgotten about Sredni Vashtar, so I had to look it up again. And I wasn't going to do two stories by Saki, but they were just simply so good. When you read them, they're just like, oh, God, this is brilliant. So Sredni Vashtar it is for our final story this evening. I'm sorry, this is brief. But this is, again, it gives an idea of something of what his life must have been like when he was younger. Because the central character in this is a very sickly, lonely child being cared for by a deeply uncaring aunt. James has told me this about Kathy, obviously.
Thanks, James.
He's upstairs swearing, it's okay. But it's, again, loads of atmosphere in this story, and it seems so advanced. You can't believe this is a story that was written before the First World War. It's so brilliantly written, and it's so creepy, and it's a bit of fun. So, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, brace yourselves for Sredni Vashta by Saki. Conradin was 10 years old, and the doctor pronounced his professional option that the boy would not live for another 5 years. The doctor was silky and effete and counted for little, but his opinion was endorsed by Mrs. de Ropp, who counted for nearly everything. Mrs. de Ropp was Conradin's cousin and guardian, and in his eyes, she represented those 3/5 of the world that are necessary and disagreeable and real. The other 2/5 in perpetual antagonism to the foregoing was summed up in himself and his imagination. One of these days, Conradin supposed he would succumb to the mastering pressure of wearisome, necessary things such as illnesses and coddling restrictions and drawn-out dullness. Without his imagination, which was rampant under the spur of loneliness, he would have succumbed long ago. Mrs. de Ropp would never, in her honested moments, have confessed to herself that she disliked Conradin, though she might have been dimly aware that thwarting him for his own good was a duty which did not find particularly irksome. Conradin hated her with a desperate sincerity which he was perfectly able to mask. Such few pleasures as he could contrive for himself gained an added relish from the likelihood that they would be displeasing to his guardian, and from the realm of his imagination she was locked out, an unclean thing which should find no entrance. In the dull, cheerless garden overlooked by so many windows that were ready to open with a message not to do this or that, or a reminder that medicines were due, he found little attraction. The few fruit trees that it contained were set jealously apart from his plucking, as though they were rare specimens of their kind, blooming in an arid waste. It would probably have been difficult to find a market gardener who would have offered 10 shillings for their entire yearly produce. In a forgotten corner, however, almost hidden behind a dismal shrubbery, was a disused tool shed of respectable proportions, and within its walls Conradin found a haven, something that took on the very aspects of a playroom and a cathedral. He peopled it with a legion of familiar phantoms, evoked partly from fragments of history and partly from his own brain, but it also boasted 2 inmates of flesh and blood. In one corner lived a ragged, plumaged Houdan hen, on which the boy lavished an affection that was scarcely another outlet. Further back in the gloom stood a large hutch, divided into 2 compartments, one of which was fronted with close iron bars. This was the abode of a large polecat ferret, which a friendly butcher boy had once smuggled, cage and all, into its present quarters in exchange for a long-secreted hoard of small silver. Conradin was dreadfully afraid of the lithe, sharp-fanged beast, but it was his most treasured possession. Its very presence in the tool shed was a secret and fearful joy, to be kept scrupulously away from the knowledge of the woman, as he privately dubbed his cousin. And one day, out of heaven knows what material, he spun the beast a wonderful name, and from that moment it had grown into a god and a religion. The woman indulged in religion once a week in a church nearby and took Conradin there with her, but to him the church service was an alien rite in the house of Rimmon. Every Thursday, in the dim and musty silence of the tool shed, he worshipped with mystic and elaborate ceremonial before the wooden hutch where dwelt Sredni Vashta, the great ferret. Red flowers in their season and scarlet berries in the wintertime were offered at his shrine, for he was a god who laid some special stress on the fierce, impatient side of things, as opposed to the woman's religion, which, as far as Conradin could observe, went to great lengths in the contrary direction. And on great festivals, powdered nutmeg was strewn in front of his hutch, an important feature of the offering being that the nutmeg had to be stolen. These festivals were of irregular occurrence and were chiefly appointed to celebrate some passing event. On one occasion, when Mrs. de Ropp suffered from acute toothache for 3 days, Conradin kept up the festival during the entire 3 days and almost succeeded in persuading himself that Sredni Vashtar was personally responsible for the toothache. If the malady had lasted for another day, the supply of nutmeg would have given out. The Houdan hen was never drawn into the cult of Sredni Vashtar. Conradin had long ago settled that she was an Anabaptist. He didn't pretend to have even the remotest knowledge as to what an Anabaptist was or what they did, but he privately hoped that it was dashing and not very respectable. Mrs. de Ropp was the ground plan on which he based and detested all respectability. After a while, Conradin's absorption in the tool shed began to attract the notice of the Guardian. It's not good for him to be pottering down there in all weathers, she promptly decided. And at breakfast one morning, she announced that the Houdan had been sold and taken away overnight. With her short-sighted eyes, she peered at Conradin, waiting for an outbreak of rage and sorrow, which he was ready to rebuke with a flow of excellent precepts and reasoning. But Conradin said nothing. There was nothing to be said. Something perhaps in his white-set face gave her a momentary qualm, for at tea that afternoon there was toast on the table, a delicacy which she usually banned on the ground that it was too bad for him. Also because the making of it gave trouble, a deadly offence in the middle-class feminine eyes. "I thought you liked toast," she exclaimed with an injured air, observing that he didn't touch it. "Sometimes," said Conradin. In the shed that evening, there was an innovation in the worship of the hutch god. Conradin had been wont to chant his praises. Tonight he asked a boon. "Do one thing for me, Sredni Vashtar." The thing was not specified. As Sredni Vashtar was a god, he must be supposed to know. And choking back a sob as he looked at the other empty corner, Conradin went back to the world he so hated. And every night, in the welcome darkness of his bedroom, and every evening in the dusk of the tool shed, Conradin's bitter litany went up. "Do one thing for me, Sredni Vashtar." Mrs. de Ropp noticed that the visits to the shed did not cease, and one day she made a further journey of inspection. "What are you keeping in that locked hutch?" she said. "I believe it's guinea pigs. I'll have them all cleared away and killed." Conradin shut his lips tight, but the woman ransacked his bedroom until she found the carefully hidden key, and forthwith marched down to the shed to complete her discovery. It was a cold afternoon, and Conradin had been bidden to keep to the house. From the furthest window of the dining room, the door of the shed could just be seen beyond the corner of the shrubbery, and there Conradin stationed himself. He saw the woman enter. He then imagined her opening the door of the sacred hutch and peering down with her short-sighted eyes into the thick straw bed where his god lay hidden. Perhaps she would prod the straw in her clumsy impatience, and Conradin fervently breathed his prayer for the last time. But he knew as he prayed that he did not believe. He knew that the woman would come out presently with that pursed smile he loathed so well on her face, and in an hour or two the gardener would carry away his wonderful god, a god no longer, but a simple brown ferret in a hutch. And he knew that the woman would triumph always as she triumphed now, and he would grow ever more sickly under her pestering and domineering and superior wisdom, till one day nothing would matter much more with him, and the doctor would be proved right. And in the sting and misery of his defeat, he began to chant loudly and defiantly the hymn of his threatened idol. Sredni Vashtar went forth. His thoughts were red thoughts, and his teeth were white. His enemies called for peace, but he brought them death. Sredni Vashtar the beautiful. And then of a sudden he stopped his chanting and drew close to the window pane. The door of the shed still stood ajar as it had been left, and the minutes were slipping by. And they were long minutes, but they slipped by nevertheless. He watched the starlings running and flying in little parties across the lawn. He counted them over and over again, with one eye always on that swinging door. A sour-faced maid came in to lay the table for tea, and still Conradin stood and waited and watched. Hope had crept by inches into his heart, and now a look of triumph began to blaze in his eyes that had only known the wistful patience of defeat. Under his breath and with a furtive exultation, he began once again the paean of victory and devastation, and presently his eyes were rewarded. Out through that doorway came a long, low, yellow and brown beast, with eyes ablink at the waning daylight, dark wet stains around the fur of jaws and throat. Conradin dropped on his knees The great polecat ferret made its way down to a small brook at the foot of the garden, drank for a moment, then crossed the little plank bridge, was lost to sight into the bushes. Such was the passing of Shredni Vashtar. "Tea's ready," said the sour-faced maid. "Where's mistress?" "She went down to the shed some time ago," said Conradin. And while the maid went to summon her mistress to tea, Conradin fished a toasting fork out of the sideboard drawer, proceeded to toast himself a piece of bread. And during the toasting of it, and the buttering of it with much butter, and the slow enjoyment of eating it, Conradin listened to the noises and silences which fell in quick spasms beyond the dining room door. The loud, foolish screaming of the maid, the answering chorus of wondering ejaculations from the kitchen region, the scuttering footsteps and hurried embassies for outside help, and then, after a lull, the scared sobbings and shuffling tread of those who bore a heavy burden back into the house. However we break it to the poor child, I couldn't for the life of me," exclaimed a shrill voice. And while they debated the matter among themselves, Conradin made himself another piece of toast. The end. So there you go, folks. So do yourself a favour, go out and buy yourself a Saki book, and I think you might enjoy yourselves. But anybody here got favourite short horror stories or ghost stories that I could maybe do another time? Any suggestions? Oh, Debsy's coming in, I think.
And I don't know, it's just what I was told as a teenager, but then I think a lot of people told it. It's that, you know, if you used to go out in the car with your first boyfriend or a group of you, and this was up in New Addington in South London,
Right.
And it'd be like, so pitch black, and then you'd be told this story that, you know, sort of 10, 15 years ago, that their couple had gone up there to be romantic, and there'd been a knock at the window, you know, and they opened the window, and this guy said, you know, you got, you know, said, oh, there was banging or something, and the guy gets out the car, and then the girl's left in the car on her own. That's it. And then there's a bang. She hears like a bang on the roof, but is terrified. Does anybody know where I'm going with this?
Is this one with the hand stuck to the?
No. So, because he's obviously got out to investigate because, you know, there's the noises, but it's pitch black. So anyway, then she hears this, like the bang on the roof, and then she's in there terrified. And about 5 minutes later, there's some headlights, and she's like, "Oh, someone's coming." Comes out and knocks on the window, and it's a policeman, and he's got a coat, and he says, "All right, darling, you know, I'm going to just put this coat over your head, and you're going to come back. You know, I'm just going to take you to the police car." As she went to the police car, she looked out, and on the roof of the car is the head of her boyfriend.
Terrifying. I have one of the myth ones.
Yes, exactly. But it was cool, but it absolutely terrified me, and I completely believed it. And then as I grew up and I moved around, people said they were told that story. It was basically the glide to stop you from getting out of the car.
Well, the one I always remember was when a long time ago, Kath, we used to go to Cobham Woods. Do you remember in Kent? Because there was supposed to be a haunted house in the middle of it. There was this old semi-derelict house, and if you went down there at night, there was always a light on upstairs, even though nobody lived there. And we went down, and you could see it. It was. We go, sorry. And Kathy's then husband Tim was telling us this story about you go down, there'd be monks walking around in the woods, and you would actually see these lunatics walking around in cows, probably just people going down to scare the shit out of people. But we went down there one evening. We were in Kathy's old car, it was an old Escort, and she was in the front. I think I can't remember who was the front. It might have been Michelle. I can't remember. And I was in the back with Tim, and he was regaling the story about how haunted these woods were, and how, you know, sometimes, and he kept saying to Kathy, "Well, slow down a bit more. You know, don't go too fast." And what he was doing was he was winding down his window in the back seat. Kathy's driving slower, and so all of a sudden he just put his hand out and he smacked the side door. His hand just appeared. Whoosh! Going through the road like a bloody rally driver at the end of it. Is anybody celebrating Halloween tomorrow? Everybody doing anything? Are you taking the darling children out trick or treating? I suppose they're too old for that now, aren't they, Goth?
No, they're loving it. They're both really up for it. Michael is going out with his girlfriend as Kurt Cobain and Courtney Love.
Oh, God.
Very good.
Very classy.
Sarah's going out as the terrifying Alvin and the Chipmunks.
Oh, that is terrifying. I'll give you that. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to spend the rest of the evening wrapping up Brussels sprouts and Ferrero Rocher wrappers. So when the kids come,
I've got the duty of staying in and pulling all the blinds shut and turning the lights off.
this place I ever lived for that. I was when I lived in Kruger, and I was in a flat 3 stories up, and the front doorbell was broken.
Yeah.
Kids can come round and ring all night. I didn't hear a bloody thing.
They're quite civilised round our way. They'll only knock at your door if you've got a pumpkin outside your
Yeah,
house.
yeah, that's the new thing, isn't it, Graham?
Yeah, it's quite nice. We haven't got one this year because the
right.
kids are going out. We thought it's not worth.
Have a quiet evening. I don't blame you. We don't get bothered. We just turn all the lights off and just paint a big word with the word "fuck off" on the door. No idea why, but it seems to work.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to go up that effing drive, do they?
Exactly.
So we don't get really bothered up here either, to be honest.
So all the Satanists are in your woods, aren't they?
Yeah.
Hire some monks to walk.
Yeah, come there. We're going to do that again. But well, look, thank you very much for coming this evening. I hope you've enjoyed the little 3.
Oh, excellent, Michael. Thank you.
Yeah.
And
Oh, she's got a cock out again.
oh no, she's got a
Cock out again.
Sorry.
Then I thought my jack-o'-lantern was the most terrifying.
Oh, yeah, the cock's out.
Yeah.
And, hopefully see you on Tuesday night for the quiz. You're still always welcome to come, Lou. You know you're very welcome to come to the quiz.
I know, Don. It's only my schedules, my work schedules, and I'm not very clever. But
We're not
Blended with
either.
this lot perfectly, love, honestly. And Graham, you and Hazel have got to come, all right?
No, we miss you. We miss you all very much indeed. Yeah,
Oh,
Thank you.
we
Graham.
will as ever.
like your
do our
bag puss,
best.
very nice.
Yeah.
No,
We
nice
will.
bag puss, mate.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, babe.
I wasn't talking about Hazel, Christ.
Rude.
Very rude.
not
Hi, Deb.
really-
Nice to see you too.
Hello.
But again,
Oh,
thank you
thank
very
you.
much for coming this evening. I'm thinking of possibly doing another one of these with some Christmas stories come Christmas time, if you're interested. We'll see how it goes. See how it
Yeah.
at it. But and also Russ, if you're interested, I've been invited to another quiz night on the 18th of November in Wanstead.
Oh, what, Simon job?
Simon, me, and Anne Edwards.
Oh, I'll come.
Brilliant, mate. Anybody
Yeah,
else,
I'm up for that.
anybody else want to come to that? Brilliant stuff. Well, look, guys, I'm going to turn the recording off now, so you're all free. There we are. Go on, recording off.